Hey, it's Joel Mark Witt and Antonia Dodge, personality hacker. We are in our back porch area here in beautiful Pennsylvania. We want to shoot a video outside since it's such a nice day and talk with you about relationships and how your Myers-Briggs type and your partner's Myers-Briggs type might inform how your relationship goes and some of the things to watch out for. And in this video, we want to talk about the dichotomies, that four-letter code you have in your Myers-Briggs type, and how your four letters and your partner's four letters, the differences and the similarities will impact how you both approach relationships and some of the maybe the challenges you have, and also some of the intimacies and things you get along with too. So let's talk about that in this video here.
So each of the dichotomies has a little bit of a different influence over our relationships and some of the conflict we might experience. And in this video, we want to relatively briefly go through some of the challenges people experience when they have different dichotomies, or even sometimes the same dichotomies, but want to experience them a little differently. So the dichotomies are your four-letter code in the Myers-Briggs system. For example, I'm an ENTP, Joel's an ENFP. That stands for extrovert, intuitive, thinker, perceiver, or extrovert, intuitive, feeler, perceiver. And you might have a different four-letter code. You might be an introvert, sensor, thinker, judger. But that's what the four-letter or the four dichotomies are that four-letter code. So extrovert, introvert is the first dichotomy. Sensing, intuition is the second dichotomy. Thinking, feeling is the third dichotomy. And judging, perceiving is the fourth dichotomy. Each of these has a slightly different manifestation and conflict when we're in a relationship. And again, it doesn't just have to be when you have different dichotomies, although that will add a tension that having similar dichotomies won't. When we have the same dichotomies, like Joel and I are both extroverts, then we both have a similar energy management style. We both need to get into the outside world because that's the real world to us. And so both of us have a simpatico or sense of simpatico when the other person starts to get stir crazy. So we understand that. However, if we're out of rhythm and Joel has a desire to go be extroverted, but I'm in a more introverted space because that's just how it happens to be, sometimes that will create conflict because we're expecting the other person to understand our needs since they almost always do. So usually when a person shares the same dichotomy, the challenge you experience is when all of a sudden you're out of sync with your usual desires. The other person might not be as sympathetic as they would if on a day-to-day basis you're figuring out how to sort of do the dance, the choreographed dance of polarity opposites.
And then also when you have the same style, both of us are extroverts, you're going to have double up maybe on the blind spots. So you both may overvalue the extroverted part. For us, for example, we might overvalue the extroverted part of our personalities and the extroverted nature of how we like to live our lives. And so then we can get into like these cycles where we don't have a lot of space for the introverted part of ourselves because we're both so go and we're in the outer world, and then we double up on those blind spots, like I said.
Exactly. Now, when you have different pairing of opposites, when you have two different dichotomies you're experiencing, that's oftentimes when conflict arises because you're just trying to get how the other person operates at a baseline. Oftentimes what that looks like is just making space for the other person's needs and desires, especially when they're different than anything that you've ever experienced yourself. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the four dichotomies and talk a little bit about how particularly when they're pairings of opposites, when you've got two different dichotomies represented in a relationship, how that can show up. So the first one is extraversion and introversion. This is the real world for us. For extroverts, the outer world's the real world, and for introverts, the inner world is the real world. And oftentimes that manifests in our energy management. When you're an introvert, you need to go into that inner sanctum, that inner world that's the real world, on a regular basis in order to get a little bit of distance from the hustle and bustle of the outer world. All that conflicting information, the information that conflicts with how you feel internally and that you're constantly trying to reconcile, you need a little bit of space from that as an introvert. Whereas as an extrovert, too much time alone can kind of start feeling mundane and like the same thing over and over. And so you need to go out into the outside world in order to get energy by being stimulated by the quote-unquote real world. So oftentimes what happens when people have two different dichotomies in the extroversion and introversion space is that they oftentimes they have trouble understanding the other person's energy management. An introvert might need a lot more alone time than the extrovert makes space for or even understands why they would need it. On the other side, an introvert might feel like the extrovert is abandoning them on a regular basis in order to go seek stimulation outside the relationship. And so energy management, or the energy management dance, is oftentimes the first thing that people need to figure out when they have two different dichotomies here.
Yeah, one more thing about the introvert extrovert split is if you're an introvert, sometimes when you're in a pair bond relationship with somebody, your inner space, that inner world, that real world for you, can sometimes map your partner. And when you're alone with your partner, it can feel like being alone by yourself. And that can be great. That can be a great intimate experience for you as an introvert. However, it goes off the rails sometimes when an extrovert may not realize that you can't have their energy. They've mapped themselves to you. You're in a situation where maybe they're being a little bit more energetic and you're like, whoa, like I have you kind of part of my inner space here, and now there's some conflict arising because you're in my inner space that's my alone time. I've mapped to you, and you may not, you extrovert, this is the introvert talking, may not be aware that I need some breathing room here. I can't handle your energy. But because my boundaries have included you, you may not be aware of that. So you're included, and now it's like a bull in a china shop for that introvert, and they feel a little overwhelmed at times. So that's something else that is counterintuitive to think about for introverts. Sometimes this can happen when they're mapping their partner to themselves.
By the same token, it can also be a really great balance.
Yeah.
The extrovert can encourage the introvert to go do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do, maybe is out of their comfort zone. It encourages the introvert to take some chances that they otherwise might not have risked. And by the same token, the introvert can encourage the extrovert to go into their inner world and explore their inner terrain, which is incredibly important for extroverts, to not avoid whatever is inside and that they have mapped there be dragons. The introvert can encourage the extrovert to go explore that inner terrain, and so they address their dragons and don't perpetually kick that can down the road.
Yeah. So the second letter is the sensor versus intuitive split. So this is a dichotomy. We did a podcast recently about this, and it's a dichotomy that we talked about has a 75 to 25% split. So about 75% of the population are sensors. That means they learn information. This is a perceiving part of you. This is how you learn and take in your world around you. 75% of people use their senses, primarily their five senses, but more senses than that: balance, taste, balance, sense of time, sense of space, things of this nature. And sensors are looking for reliable, verifiable information, things that can be relied upon and verified in the outer world, or in their world, basically. Whereas 25% of the population uses an intuitive process. We talk about this being advanced pattern recognition. The idea of taking little pieces, you still use your senses, right? But taking little pieces of sensory input and speculating on what if scenarios, behind the curtain type thinking. So you may not be able to prove or verify something, but because you've gotten so good at pattern recognizing and doing that so much in your life, that you can speculate on something, quote unquote, behind the curtain, and get pretty good at it over time. And that's about 25% of the population. So it's very common for a relationship to emerge where one partner is a sensor and one partner potentially could be an intuitive, and there could be a disconnect there because, again, this is how we perceive our world. So this might be jarring to see this person seeing the world so radically different than how I see it, and that can cause conflict. And it can cause some, distress. Like, I don't understand how maybe the sensor in a relationship might say, I don't understand why you're always asking what if questions and thinking of abstract stuff. Like, let's focus on what's here, what's present, and what we can actually see, taste, touch, feel, and verify in the world. And here the intuitive is saying, well, I love the fact that you're really involved in all this, specific things in the world, but let's talk about other high-minded ideals, abstract concepts. Let's ask the big questions, imaginative questions. Both people can obviously play in each other's sandboxes a little bit, but there is somewhat of a what's the word? It's like a distance between the two, almost like you can't quite connect. You can't quite touch each other's hands, almost like you're across. We use this metaphor of like a stream, and you're just reaching, you're grasping, and you just can't touch the other person on the other side fully. You can communicate, but there's just that little bit of barrier there. And often in relationship, this can cause, we believe, an emotion of sadness. So there's this sense of my partner may not fully get everything about me, who I am and how I see the world. And that can be disheartening. That can feel almost like you don't have a partner that has that full depth of intimacy that you might crave in your relationship.
Right. And it can come out as frustration. It can manifest as a lot of different things, but that that feeling of a barrier of intimacy is why there's an underlying feeling of sadness in sensing and or sensor intuitive relationships at times. But there is a bridge that can bridge over that stream, and that bridge is profound appreciation. We don't always or exclusively create intimacy on shared simpatico, right? Like we can also have intimacy built on an appreciation of the other,
Yeah.
and reaching out towards the other person and being willing to play in their sandbox as often as possible. But we don't have to live in each other's sandboxes in order to have intimacy. So that sadness can simply be replaced with a feeling of gratitude that the other person is covering something that you might not be able to cover yourself, because there is a sense of the cost of specialization. In the cost of specialization, we focus on certain things that feed and nourish us at the exclusion of other things that aren't as interesting. And in a sensor intuitive relationship, oftentimes intuitives can handle things more like meaning making and forward or future pacing, whereas the sensor oftentimes handles the day-to-day and the management and ensuring that the intuitive doesn't get too far out of the realm of reality. And so in sensor intuitive relationships can be a beautiful thing as long as there's deep appreciation for how the other one operates and not simply a feeling of a chasm between the two.
Yeah.
Now, in a sensor relationship, sometimes it's a matter of the conflict comes with not agreeing on how things should be managed. And for intuitives, sometimes it comes in projecting meaning that doesn't actually exist onto the partner. So there are challenges that can come in same type or same dichotomy relationships, but oftentimes it's not the same sense of sadness that you'll experience in sensing and intuition or sensor intuitive relationships rather. So deep appreciation is usually the antidote to that kind of situation. So the third dichotomy is the thinker-feeler dichotomy. Thinkers and feelers do both, of course. All thinkers feel and all feelers think. But this is based on a way that we have sort of the evaluative criteria we use to make decisions. We either make them on more impersonal criteria as a thinker, or we make them on more personal criteria as a feeler. This doesn't mean that feeler equals emotional and thinkers equal detached, although there is some correlation there at times based on the comfort levels that each person has with emotional spaces or the personal spaces versus the impersonal. But it's not a good idea to conflate the two, because this is basically more talking about or diagnosing the should statements that we make about the world. What should people be doing? Should they be focused more on the emotional impact that things are having on individuals and others? Or should they be focused more on the resources or the ideas that are generated from thought and from management?
And like metrics and things.
Exactly.
So one of the things that arises here often in couples, this is probably the realm where society puts labels onto us the most as people. So if you're in a relationship, if you are a thinker, that means that the way you show up, basically society has a lot of rules around this. So as an example, let's say you're an INTP female. Well, you show up as a female in the relationship. Society has a lot of gender roles they may place on you. And they might treat you as if you should show up as a feeler, even though you're an INTP, you're clearly a thinker. And so there could be some stresses here. Maybe even your partner has some expectations put upon you because you are counter to, quote unquote, the type the world wants you to be. You know, that maybe the way you express femininely or whatever that society has, the rules they have for you. So this is where some conflict can happen. The partner, the extended family, society at large might have certain rules put upon you based on what they think you should show up like, and you might be wired a little different than that. And so this is where I think some conflict can happen. I think great intimacy can happen here too. I mean, when we talk about all this stuff, we're talking about the conflicts in relationships, right? But there is some good stuff that can come from it as well. I'm a feeler male, and Tony is a thinker female, and it works really well for our relationship. And society, though, might give us messages that we're doing things wrong based on how we're showing up.
Right.
So I think that's something to watch out for in your relationship, especially if you're like, oh, I'm projecting onto my partner a bunch of roles and expectations based on maybe their gender or the way we met or the way we got together, and here they may be wired completely different from that.
Right. Same thing would apply for, say, like an ESFJ man, where there's a challenge in all of these suggested roles that the conflict often happens internally.
Yeah.
And so whatever baggage or anything that you're bringing from these suggested roles from the outside world and how you see yourself, you're going to bring that into the relationship. So not only are you dealing with a difference in opinion of how things should be evaluated, but you might also be bringing your own internal conflict with how you are responding and reacting to these suggested roles from the outer world. So in the thinking feeling dichotomy, one of the challenges is that we bring everybody into the relationship, right? We bring all of society into our relationship because we feel some conflict around wanting to match some of these suggested roles. And this can actually also work in a same-sex relationship, as who takes on which roles and how does that look will sometimes be a cause of some confusion in the relationship. And then you've just got basic, how should life work? How should things be happening? And even in thinker-thinker, same dichotomy relationships, two thinkers can have wildly different ideas about how things should be happening, and the same thing with two feelers, especially if they're using slightly different feeler criteria or slightly different thinker criteria. So oftentimes the battle happens both in bringing suggested roles into the relationship, the internal conflict a person will be feeling based on those suggested roles, and then also a difference in opinion of how things should be happening. What school should we go to? What religion should our children be? All sorts of should statements get in there. And so a deep understanding and, again, a profound appreciation for how each person is wired and the criteria they're bringing into the relationship is very important in order to bridge some of those conversations.
Yeah. So let's talk about that last letter, right? So we've talked about the first three. This is the JP split, the judger versus perceiver. And this letter is actually really about organization. Oftentimes people will mischaracterize this, that judgers are the organized people and perceivers are disorganized. Those are mostly judges saying that probably, but and I guess I could agree with that in a general sense. But really what it is, it's about where you prefer your organization. It's not really about being organized in general. It's about where are you organized. Judgers tend to want to organize their outer world and their outer space and all the things outside here so they can have inner freedom of emotion and thought and be able to wander the garden of their mind or wander their emotions internally. And this is something that I think is very obvious to the outer world in organization, right? But when it comes to perceivers prefer to have all of their freedom in the outer world. They like to be able to be spontaneous, turn on a dime. You know, your friend calls you last minute, run out the door and go do something fun with them without having to like check in or have it on your calendar. In order to have that kind of freedom, it requires perceivers to be extremely organized inside of their own minds and hearts. So their emotions and their thoughts are extremely organized internally. And so this is more about organization and where it's placed than it is organization in general.
For perceivers, the organization internally oftentimes looks like being very certain about what means something to them, a sense of integrity, wanting to know what their values are and what's important to them, so that when they're improvising or in a situation of spontaneity, they won't do anything to betray who they are. Whereas for judgers, they much prefer to have organization in the outside world because that's how you ensure that you'll be in alignment with yourself, by creating a structure around you that always sort of keeps you honest. And so both, as Joel mentioned, both want freedom and both want organization. It's just which world do they want it in, internally or externally. So of course the conflict oftentimes happens on that battlefield. How organized do things need to be? How crazy is your spouse making you, either with their too free-form nature or with what is perceived as rigidity? Now, what's interesting is that oftentimes judgers get a bad rap for being rigid and perceivers get a bad rap for being too freeform. But the reality is that a perceiver can be just as rigid in how they feel internally in their sense of integrity or identity, and they can drive a judger crazy with that internal rigidity. Yeah. While they're driving the judger crazy with their outer world freedom, and vice versa. A perceiver can be driven crazy by a judger's perceived rigidity in the outside world with schedules or how they want things to be done in the outside world, and at the same time, the perceiver can sometimes not understand why the inner world of a judger doesn't seem to be as certain. And so this is, again, solved by appreciation. Oftentimes, understanding what the other person is bringing to the situation will help smooth over some of these wrinkles. A judger can, by the same token, be frustrated with the rigidity of identity of a perceiver. They can also be appreciative of the fact that the perceiver knows themselves so well and has a sense of certainty about what means something to them. And at the same time, the perceiver can appreciate the judger's organization abilities and the ability to stay on task and to basically run the marathon of life in a very elegant way. On the flip side, the perceiver can also appreciate sort of an openness that judgers have internally. When they're still working out what means something to them, they can oftentimes be quite open-minded, interestingly enough. And the perceiver or the judger can appreciate the perceiver's ability to be an early responder, to be somebody who can rush in and take care of things last minute,
Yeah.
work really well in the 11th hour, make sure that the crises of life, even if the perceiver themselves appears to be creating them, can handle the crises of life as well. And so, again, it's a matter of being appreciative or having gratitude. Perceiver to perceiver relationships, it's usually a matter of who has to take care of the daily chores. And so that's usually the challenge that the two face. And so if you're in a same dichotomy relationship of a perceiver to a perceiver, usually the battlefield is who has to handle all the mundane stuff. And if you're two judgers, sometimes you find yourself handling life pretty well, but then nothing is very exciting. And you wonder, how can we spruce this up? So everybody has challenges regardless of what dichotomy that they prefer. And at the same time, most of the time, the antidote is just sheer appreciation.
So these are just some basic principles. Obviously, there's a wealth more of things to think about, to talk about. These are just some comparisons between the dichotomies that you might find conflict in your relationship. You might find some intimacy in your relationship too, depending on these configurations. And we've just scratched the surface. Literally, we can't talk about every single type on this video. If you compared all 16 Myers-Briggs types with all the other all 16 to 16, was that 256 type combinations, right? So it's a mass amount of combinational possibilities between types. So these are general principles. You'll need to take basically your 4-letter code and your partner's 4-letter code and just take some of the principles we talked about here on this video and then compare and contrast some of the things that might be conflicts for you. You might make a quick little list of some of the frustrations or conflicts and maybe also some of the gratitudes and thankfulness you have for the other person and just match that to which of these dichotomies you think those are coming from. That's a great exercise to try on your own time to see how that plays out. And again, this is just the dichotomy level. We haven't even started to talk about cognitive functions, which is basically the mental wiring of your mind, how you learn information or perceive your world and how you decide or evaluate that information and judge or make decisions about those things you perceive in the world. And we probably need to shoot some more videos on that to talk about how those might be sources of conflict or intimacy for you in your relationship. If you want more information, go over to personalityhacker.com. We have articles, numerous podcasts, more videos, tons of resources there for your personality type and your partner's personality type. And we'd recommend you come over and learn more about yourself and the people in your life. And we want an intimate, powerful, deep, connected relationship for you. That's our desire. And hopefully that can be possible with the right information and shared values, interests, and all the things that will make a great relationship. So we'll talk with you on the next video.